You're the perfect blend of elegance and style, and your ride should be no different. The 2024 Hyundai Sonata Hybrid meets all your needs, from business to brunch and everywhere in between. With head-turning details like a sleek front end, plus stylish interior, and an available 12.3-inch digital instrument cluster and seamless tech integration. Okay, Hyundai. Visit HyundaiUSA.com to learn more about the new 2024 Hyundai Sonata Hybrid.
Pepsid Complete knows that food is one of the best parts of game day. That is, until heartburn strikes. Thankfully, just one chewable tablet of Pepsid Complete provides dual-action heartburn relief with an antacid that starts working instantly and an acid reducer that lasts all day. So you can stay focused on that second helping of chili without worrying about heartburn. All day based on 8-hour symptom relief studies during the day. Use product only as directed.
Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have a very esteemed guest. I'm honored to have the great Katherine Bayford on the line. Hello, Katherine.
Hello, John. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. For those of you who don't know Katherine, she's a big name in the Napoleonic circles, and she's actually working on a biography of the Bonaparte family called The Bonapartes, which should be out soon. We can't wait to read that book. And you can find her on Twitter with a handle KEBAYF, which is just KE-BAF, or BAF, short for Bayford. And yeah, we're thrilled to have you. Katherine, how did you kind of get into the Napoleonic age and era? What interested you in it?
I was always very, very highly interested in Napoleon. I was always very interested in Napoleon, in military strategy. And so as a teenager, I was just hugely into Vietnam. I was into failures of strategy. And it was when I started maybe becoming a later teen that I started really appreciating the successes of military strategy and tactics, where it can go, who was most ingenious. And I just found myself, of course, getting more and more and more drawn to Napoleon. It was only really when I started studying at St Andrews under Sir Hugh Strawn, who's a huge Bonaparte enthusiast and is absolutely brilliant, that I just felt like I had a little community of people out there who I could talk to about. And I was kind of poring over, David Chandler and so on. And over time, yeah, exactly, it's phenomenal. And over time, of course, you start talking about this more online, and you start meeting the 36 or so other Napoleonic obsessives, including yourself.
That's right. Yeah, there's a tiny circle of us, but it's a very supportive circle, as we were talking earlier. So I asked Katherine to come on. We're going to discuss today the succession crisis, air quotes, crisis of Napoleon's, and kind of how it led to his divorce to Josephine, his remarriage, and then his actual heir, and how all that turned out. Spoiler alert, it didn't turn out all that well. But we'll get into that. So let's kind of start with Napoleon and Josephine's marriage first. Josephine had two children from a previous marriage, Hortense and Eugene. So clearly, Napoleon probably hoped to have kids with Josephine. Why do you think they were unable to conceive?
This is kind of one of the grand mysteries of Napoleon's life. There's absolutely no reason to believe that Josephine cannot have any more children. She has two perfectly happy, healthy, well children, one a boy and one a girl. And everyone makes a big deal out of how much older Josephine is than Napoleon. There's not a huge age difference. She's still ostensibly a perfectly fertile woman. And so when they're married and no child emerges, there's very obviously a number of questions. The first of which is, who's kind of, in inverted commas, responsible for this, right? There's a question, is Napoleon himself capable of having children? Because Josephine is, she's proven it. This seems immensely obvious. Now, we know, of course, in time, that it's obviously Josephine who can't have the children, which isn't obvious when the marriage first begins. But there's no obvious, say, gynecological issues. There's no obvious medical issues. In time, of course, she'll end up going to the springs and going to the spas and hoping for this sort of miracle child. But especially for the first period of their marriage, there's no real obvious crisis about the fact that no child has emerged. Napoleon certainly wants a child, partially due to the natural impulses of individuals, partially because he loves his wife. But over time, it becomes more of a pressing political matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've read different things like, Hortense and Eugene were born before the French Revolution, before Josephine had to go through prison, and her first husband was guillotined. So clearly she had a very stressful couple of years there where she was almost guillotined. So you wonder if that messed with her, her biology, or if it was just, so happens sometimes you can't conceive at a later age. It could be a number of things. So I think Napoleon probably thought, all right, well, she's had 2 kids, like you pointed out, Catherine. Maybe she'll have more with me. And yeah, it's just unfortunate they weren't able to conceive, because you wonder if they would have stayed married if she had produced an heir for him.
Yeah, I mean, they stayed married through a lot. The chances, the kind of ultimate reason for the breakdown of the marriage, the literal divorce, is precisely the fact that she cannot provide this child to him. And obviously, I'm sure we'll get to this in time. But yes, absolutely. Josephine goes through an immensely stressful period during the French Revolution. She feels like a real survivor. She is a very literal survivor. Her husband is executed. She's on the wait list to be executed in prison, and her execution is spared only by Robespierre's own. She goes through this kind of immense psychological trauma. And this actually contributes to the next stage in her life, because Josephine has been in a loveless, pretty miserable marriage for a decent amount of time. Her husband is off. He's not entirely interested in her. He's executed. She's about to be executed and saved. And she almost gets to the end of this, and it's as if she thinks to herself, now I'm really going to live. Now life can be kind of gay and free, and you only live once, and the world's my oyster here. And right. Josephine ends up becoming the mistress of a number of very powerful men in late revolutionary France, including, of course, Paul Bras and so on. She's not interested in settling down per se. She's not interested necessarily in being a mother and having children. She eventually, of course, marries Napoleon Bonaparte, this immensely successful young general, seemingly primarily for security above all else. And even then, she doesn't seem particularly interested in him.
Yeah, stability and wealth, I would imagine. She was a notorious spendthrift. Yeah.
Yes.
But,
this is the bane of Napoleon's life for a little while. It's just the amount of money that she and certain members of his family are getting through.
Yeah. Well, if the TV show The Game of Thrones has taught us nothing else, it's that a clear and concise succession plan is important to any empire or country that hopes to avoid war after the death of a monarch. So what was Napoleon's plan for his dynasty and succession and all that?
France goes from being a directory to a consulate to an empire. The need for Napoleon to have a successor obviously becomes much, much more prominent. At the beginning, he'd like to have a child with his wife. He'd like to have a son. He's getting very excited. Josephine actually at one point pretends to have conceived a child with him, pretends to be pregnant, purely so that she can stay in France and spend more time with her lover, whilst he's off in Italy being, the hero of revolutionary France. It's all very naughty and will come to bite her in the backside later. But Napoleon's plan for succession evolves with time. He doesn't make one kind of core strategic plan and stick to it. This is something which will evolve depending on circumstances in life. So there's certainly a period in time in which Napoleon's brothers seem like they may very well be the best fit for this. So we have Joseph, for instance, who's immensely important to Napoleon, especially during that sort of transitory time between the end of the revolution and the beginning of the consulate. Joseph is kind of indispensable to him for a number of years, a real right hand. He's bestowed with all these wonderful honors when France becomes an empire. Likewise, you have another good candidate, perhaps, in younger brother Louis, who Napoleon ends up kind of molding into what he hopes to be almost a bit of a mini-me within the army. Of course, there's very, very little that Napoleon respects in an individual more than kind of military prowess and strategic ability.
And you make a good point. This is before Louis' failures in Holland and Joseph's in Spain. Joseph actually is a good politician. He negotiated the Treaty of Amiens. And, I think Napoleon had high hopes for him and Louis if they were going to be his successor.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in the space of just a few years, both of these fail so dramatically in Napoleon's eyes that he starts having private conversations with people where he's saying, essentially, I'm up at night worried about the idea that one of my brothers might inherit. This is such a nightmare to him that it's actually panicking him. Mm-hmm. So you think, okay, Napoleon thinks to himself, okay, perhaps not a brother. Well, then who? And here becomes a big problem because, of course, he's not having children with Josephine. You think, okay, not a child with Josephine, not a brother, who can it possibly be? Napoleon and Josephine end up organizing a marriage between Louis, who again at this point is probably Napoleon's favorite brother, and Hortense, Josephine's daughter. And the idea is kind of that they might become a bit of a conduit for a potential heir to be born. And this would do two things. This would both provide Napoleon with an obvious, viable heir, but it would also keep the marriage intact. Both Josephine and Napoleon really want to remain in this marriage for various reasons.
Was Prince Eugene, Josephine's son from her previous marriage, was he ever an option, do you think?
In a way, yes. He's intelligent, he's humble, he's capable, he's very loving. Napoleon treats these children in many ways like they're his own. He really genuinely loves them. He's a little bit odd, so he doesn't always show this in ways that most people would appreciate at the time. But he really, really loves and respects them. And with his stepson in particular, there's this feeling that he perhaps is just a little bit more competent and a little bit more suitable than Napoleon's own brothers. So he ends up being made Napoleon's ostensible heir to the Italian crown, but not France, importantly.
Yeah, and I know he runs pretty much northern Italy for Napoleon for many, many years and does, from what everyone can tell, a capable job. And like you mentioned earlier, he has military prowess, which Napoleon highly sought in his heir. So yeah, you think Prince Eugene would be an option, but that's not a direct bloodline to Napoleon like he wanted.
Certainly not. And Eugene kind of has a problem which a lot of Napoleon's siblings have, in that they are not married to the people that Napoleon envisioned them married to. Now, Eugene makes the best match he can, and he actually marries in a way that pleases his stepfather. But one of the reasons why Napoleon's brothers are so inadequate in his mind is that Napoleon has become emperor. He's created what he thinks is going to be a new Europe. He's slowly becoming master, almost unparalleled master of Europe. And he thinks to his siblings, all you have to do is marry the person I tell you to marry, create heirs which will then rule Europe for goodness knows how long, and also just manage the state in which you rule. And in his mind, they don't manage to.
Right, but it's hard when you get to these new lands that you're told to rule, and you're trying to do good to the citizens there, but you're also taking orders from Napoleon in Paris. So it's hard to please both parties.
Yeah, and Napoleon's a real control freak, and he also feels like he has to be a control freak because the siblings keep disappointing him in myriad political ways, and it therefore creates this kind of perpetual cycle of destruction, where, by the end, Joseph's so nervous that every single decision kind of goes off to his brother first, who gets more and more annoyed about this, but kind of requests it more and more. The entire thing's just a nightmare. And like I say, they're also just marrying entirely inadequate people. So, we have Caroline is marrying Murat. he's an innkeeper's son. Napoleon's got the idea that she's going to be marrying, maybe even an emperor, but at least a prince or someone. We've got, again, Pauline is marrying the man that she's kind of caught with. These are not the people that Napoleon expects his sisters to marry, and his brothers, he feels, end up making exactly the same mistakes. Lucien, marries terribly. The only one who makes a match he's truly happy with is Louis, who's instructed to marry Hortense. Neither of them really want to marry each other. Obviously, it's a horrific pairing. The entire thing's a disaster in many ways.
Yeah, for those who wonder what a control freak Napoleon was, there was an old joke. If there was a fire in Milan, they would have to check with Paris to see if they could put it out. It was that strict of a setup. But we mentioned earlier Louis and Hortense. There was talk of Napoleon's nephew, I think it was the firstborn of Louis and Hortense, succeeding the emperor. I know Napoleon doted on this child. What happened to him?
Yeah, he was a beautiful little boy. He was called Napoleon Charles. He's absolutely perfect. He's got these sort of wide, owlish Bonaparte eyes. He even looks like the emperor. And Napoleon is just delighted by this boy. And Josephine is too. She's delighted by him. She's also highly, highly relieved because he represents a kind of second generation, a potential heir. Now, this is never immensely explicit, but everyone understands that this boy is special to Napoleon, and therefore special to the Bonaparte family. Napoleon sort of delighting in his personality as well. He seems to kind of have a bit of an aptitude almost for military matters. He's sort of walking through the gardens of palaces and he's sort of saying, "Long live non the soldier," and all of this kind of stuff. And he's wearing his little uniforms. Napoleon really dotes on him. Again, Napoleon, a man who can be quite proud, is sort of crawling about on the floor like a horse, letting him ride him. He really, really loves this boy. He's sort of all hope and vitality of this joint sort of Bonaparte family in many ways. And then he dies. He dies at the age of 4, and everyone is devastated. Hortense is devastated by the loss of her son. Hortense is also in a very, very unhappy marriage with Louis. Again, we talk about Napoleon being a control freak, where Louis, kind of, I think, boarding up, the doors to their family home so that she can't get out and sort of have affairs, which she's not having. He's spying on her. He's absolutely incandescent. He doesn't believe that, the child could be his. He turns very, very nasty. And Napoleon, for a while, really, really grieves this boy quite deeply, but he does so in a very limited way. So, a couple of weeks pass, and Hortense, who's still obviously absolutely devastated at the death of her son, is getting letters from Napoleon sort of saying, "I do wish you'd pull yourself together. Grief has its limits. You're sort of embarrassing everyone with this." And in many ways, I think it's because Napoleon, who's personally devastated by the loss of this boy that he loves, is also devastated by the realization that, anything other than your own firstborn child, and hopefully a few of them, is a bit too risky. So Napoleon comes to this realization quite quickly after the death of Napoleon Charles. I really do need to get my own heir. And so makes a number of decisions on that basis.
Yeah. It is ironic, though, that another child of Hortense and Louis will be somewhat an heir to the empire. But we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So moving along the timeline, eventually through numerous affairs that Napoleon has, he learns he can produce children. He knows that it's not his fault that they're not conceiving. So he makes a tough decision to divorce Josephine. I mean, that's got to be tough for Josephine.
Yeah, most definitely. Napoleon's known for a little while that he's capable of having children. He's first essentially manipulated into it by his family, and he has an affair with a serving girl who gives birth to a boy. And this young maid essentially turns around and says, I'd love to name him after you in honor of you. And Napoleon still doesn't entirely believe that this child is biologically his, so doesn't allow her to do so. She can't name it Napoleon, so she ends up naming it Leon, which I think is quite a nice little touch. But then he has another affair with a noble woman, of which, again, a bastard son is produced. And Napoleon at this point thinks, I'm pretty sure I am the father here. I'm pretty sure I'm therefore able to have children. And so in combination with the death of this boy, this leads to this kind of what seems like quite obvious conclusion for him at this point. Now, he really drags his feet over this. He does not really want to do it, partially because he doesn't really want to tell Josephine and actually have to... It's like any kind of man in a relationship where they've mentally moved on from. He doesn't really want to have to deal with the repercussions from this.
Right.
So it takes a little while. He's sort of prepping people slightly. He's not entirely committing to it. He's sort of indicating to people what's going to happen. Josephine knows that the writing's on the wall. Everyone knows that the writing's on the wall, but this is just dragged out to a really painful degree. And as such, when the inevitable occurs, I think the end of November of that year, he has a conversation with Josephine in which he tells her, we're getting divorced. I need to remarry. I need to be able to produce an heir. And she's, in hysterics. She's trying to put on a brave face, but she's weeping, she's crying, she's sort of writing all these letters about how terrible her life is. She's really not in a very good state. They actually divorce officially quite quickly after that, because when you're emperor, you can make the machinery of the state really work for you and your needs.
Yeah, you're not waiting in line at the courthouse. Yeah, but he takes care of her, right? He sets her up with a stipend and a palace.
Oh yeah, it's a very good deal for Josephine. Josephine hasn't always been a particularly good wife, she gets a very good amount of money. She gets malmaison, she gets a very, very nice life. And interestingly as well, and this will become a feature of his second marriage, Napoleon retains the confidence of Josephine and vice versa. So he will kind of call on her and rely on her emotionally in many ways.
And I think that's an important point to bring up. He keeps her, he doesn't kick her out of Paris. They're still friends. He still wants her counsel and advice. So obviously it's not the ending Josephine wanted, but she's still involved with him. She still has access to him, and she's not just thrown out into the cold. She has money and a mansion. She does all right for herself.
Yeah, she's still a very influential, rich woman in and around Paris and France. Absolutely.
Yeah. So he then searches for a new wife. And I know he potentially wanted to marry a Russian princess, but Tsar Alexander wouldn't commit to the pairing and kind of dragged his feet. So instead, he marries Marie Louise of Austria. What do we know of her?
Which is interesting. She's the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, who's been put in a very awkward position by Napoleon in a number of different ways, which I'm sure we'll come back to in a bit. Now, Marie Louise herself is quite interesting because in many ways she's almost the anti-Josephine. She's almost cripplingly shy, nervous, sweet, virginal, inexperienced. She's not kind of a particularly sophisticated woman, certainly not in the way that Josephine is, i.e. kind of sexually sophisticated and world-wise. She's unlike Josephine, who isn't necessarily the most attractive, prettiest of women, but has a certain pull. There's something quite desirable about Josephine. Marie Louise is just a little bit, chubby and tall and shy and awkward and so on. And she's also grown up thinking that Napoleon is a complete monster. So she kind of walks into this marriage almost as if she's going to a terrible fate. Now, she does what she has to do because she's a very sweet, diligent, loving daughter, but she sort of, I think, begs her father once, do I really have to do this? And he says yes. And she thinks, okay, I have to steel myself for this. And I'm going to go to, the French ergo, and I'm going to be the wife, the bride of the monster, and it's all going to be so horrible and terrible. And Marie Louise was a very romantic young woman. She's always thought that she's going to marry, a very dashing, beautiful man who loves her and has lots of babies with her. And instead she finds herself heading over to France to marry, the greatest monster in Europe.
We off?
30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree.
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet.
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
Love, exciting and new.
Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever.
It's a love.
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships at Bermudan and British Registry.
And she's really young at that. I think she was 18, 19 at the time.
Yeah, and she is just a protected young aristocratic girl.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that she turns up in France and she meets Napoleon. And again, Napoleon goes into this marriage with quite low expectations for the actual relationship itself. He says, I'm marrying a womb, not a woman. He almost is, again, kind of reassuring Josephine at this point, okay, I'm going to have to marry another woman, but I really, you're the love of my life, is what he's kind of turning around and telling her. And so they're both going into this marriage with various levels of trepidation. They don't have high expectations for it whatsoever. And then they meet and they get married, and Marie Louise thinks, oh, he's quite lovely, actually. She finds him quite handsome. She thinks he's very charming, he's very gentle, and suddenly this marriage kind of transforms because imminently, because all of a sudden she has the marriage that she's kind of been dreaming about. She has this dashing emperor who seems to really like her and perhaps even love her and want lots of children with her and buys her lots of jewels. And again, Napoleon finds himself surprised. He's suddenly married to, a very sweet, charming, blushing young bride. And he really likes this.
And I think it's interesting, we'll come to this. Napoleon, I think, really started to like her. Like, even when he was on Elba and we returned for the 100 days, like, he wanted to see not only his child, but he wanted to see his wife. Like, he wanted to hang out with her and see her on exile, and they wouldn't let her. So the Allies wouldn't let her visit him. But I think that just shows that he did really like her. This is another example. Napoleon and Marie Louise quickly produced the male heir, Napoleon II, i.e. the King of Rome in 1811. But I think it's important to point out that Marie Louise had a difficult delivery of the baby, and Napoleon told the doctors to save his wife above all else. And I think this really shows that he isn't a monster solely focused on his legacy or empire, correct?
I would agree with that. The marriage is a real success in a way that neither of them expect it to be. But also Napoleon sort of has this situation of stated versus revealed preferences, right? In the sense that Napoleon will insist throughout his life, he's almost quite sexist even by the standards of the day. He thinks, look, women belong at home, you've got a woman and she's going off and having affairs, you need to kind of keep a leash on her, like relatively limited education needed here, blah, 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 blah. And then he goes off and he marries Josephine. So obviously, he doesn't de facto want this, but he thinks he does. And then he ends up with Marie Louise, who is all of these things. And actually, he's just so happy. It's like, in many ways, a weight's lifted off his shoulders. He's no longer the young man he was when he married Josephine, being humiliated by her kind of openly taking lovers and scorning him and mocking him sort of publicly to her other lovers and all of these terrible things. He's just got a nice wife and she's pregnant and he really likes her, and the whole thing's quite, in many ways, almost quite sweet. Again, stated versus revealed preferences. Napoleon wants a child, Napoleon wants a son, Napoleon needs an heir, and yet he turns around, as you say, and says, look, if you have to save one of them, save the mother. Again, I think this is a kind of a real tell.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So what is Napoleon's reaction to this healthy baby boy? I know there's like a 100 cannon salute in Paris when he's born. He finally got what he wanted, but I also understand like he was a doting father. Like he wanted to play with a child and be around it. Like he didn't just hand it off to the servants.
Yeah, Napoleon's delighted. He even sort of starts going into rooms that he doesn't need to go into where, you know, a nanny is taking care of the child or whatever, just so that he can go and see him and spend time with him. He makes it well known to Marie Louise how much he loves her and how much he loves their son. He spends a lot of time with the boy, kind of snatch time throughout the day. He's absolutely elated, couldn't be happier with this turn of events.
It's just really charming to see him like that because you just think of him, like if you don't really know Napoleon, you think of him as this warmonger, but there's more to him than that. Unfortunately, though, moving on in the story, Napoleon loses his throne in 1814 and 1815. Do you think his son was ever an option to replace him for the victorious Allies? I know Napoleon wanted to abdicate in favor of his youthful son.
Napoleon certainly wants this. Napoleon essentially turns around to the Allies and he says, okay, fine, you got me, exile it is, but obviously the King of Rome remains the King of Rome, right? No, they will not allow this to happen whatsoever. There's a couple of people who may or may not be arguing for this, but broadly speaking, this is way too dangerous. We've seen what can happen, you know, with the first exile when you try to kind of keep a Bonaparte and, you know, light chains. It doesn't work. They're way too nervous about it. In many ways, it's a little bit like Alexander the Great. In that Alexander the Great dies, and he has an heir, but it's a child in utero. The boy's an infant at this point. The throne cannot be held for him. They don't want to risk trying to manipulate him. What if he's just like his father? You know, you unmalleable character. And so this is just not allowed to happen. So with the boy, they end up essentially carting him off to Austria with his mother. And much like Germany in the late 1940s undergoes a rigorous denazification programming, this boy will undergo a kind of rigorous de-Bonapartification programming. And he'll grow up speaking German with a German name, far removed from any kind of news of his father, not allowed access to any kind of people that may be sympathetic to Bonapartism. You know, he's kept in a small room in the kind of stark Schönbrunn palace, miserable.
The whole thing is they even bring in Marshal Marmont to be his tutor for a little bit, and it's like the ultimate betrayer of Napoleon. It's just a very odd upbringing, I would say.
Yeah, and they also, as well, you know, we've spoken about the fact that Marie Louise is just cripplingly naive. And this is a feature that she doesn't really grow out of during this period. So you've spoken about the fact that, you know, when Napoleon's in exile, he's trying to keep in contact with his wife and his son. He's trying to tell his wife that he loves her, he wants to see her, all of this kind of stuff. And Marie Louise is just led to believe that Napoleon, you know, it's some kind of dangerous liaisons type thing. Napoleon never loved you. He married you for your womb entirely. He's out having affairs. He's forgotten about you. He never cared about you, all of this kind of stuff. And then they put her essentially under the protection of a very, very dashing, handsome, aristocratic count. And they say, take care of her. So she ends up very swiftly forgetting Napoleon, again sort of manipulated to believe that her marriage was kind of a sham anyway, and ends up in a morganatic marriage with this count, and again largely separated from her child. It's all very sad.
Yeah, and unfortunately Napoleon, who's exiled to St. Helena and dies there in 1821, so basically from 1814 on he doesn't see either one of them. What happens to his son, Napoleon II?
He ends up dying as a very young man. Again, he has this intentionally immensely isolated upbringing. And he dies of an illness. Absolutely no foul play suspected whatsoever, but he ends up dying of an illness as a very young man. Eventually, in 1944, during, I think, the German occupation of Paris, his remains are transferred into the Army Museum in Paris, where Napoleon is obviously entombed in this glorious thing. And again, as you kind of walk around Napoleon's kind of vast imperial tomb, as you sort of walk to the other side, there's just a little kind of inlay with a marble slab in his remains, and it says the eaglet, which is so beautiful. I think the little eaglet, so tragic. He never obviously really has a life. He certainly never has a life of his own. He's never allowed to have even the potential to become the man that his father wanted him to be. But of course, he becomes in some ways a bit of a tragic figure for the Bonapartist cause. And so it's at least effective propaganda, which is why, for instance, Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, will call himself the Third in order to acknowledge, the lost second.
It's a weird twist of fate to me because, as you mentioned, the other son of Hortense and Louis becomes Napoleon III, who's emperor for even longer than Napoleon is. So I guess in a roundabout way, Napoleon did indeed have a successor, but it's Josephine's grandson, and it's not really directly related to Napoleon. I mean, yes, it is through Louis, but I guess he got a successor in a way.
Yeah, Europe, the Allies go to kind of great pains in order to ensure that there isn't some kind of young, romantic, heroic boy who wishes to kind of take up the Bonapartist mantle and reclaim France as a new Napoleon. And so they do absolutely everything they can focused on Napoleon II in order to prevent this from happening. And Napoleon III kind of slips through the cracks here. This boy exists. This situation occurs. He does become a dictator. He does become an emperor 2.0 or arguably 3.0. In many ways, therefore, Napoleon III is both a literal and a spiritual heir to his uncle. A literal heir in the obvious sense, a spiritual heir in the fact that he's the one. There is a lot of second generation Bonapartes. Napoleon has a lot of siblings who themselves have a lot of children, and it's only Napoleon III who really reaches and strives for this, thus making him in many ways a real worthy successor.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, final question for you, and this is always just opinion. Do you think if Josephine had produced an heir for Napoleon, that they would have stayed together?
In my opinion, absolutely. I don't think Napoleon would have divorced Josephine whatsoever had they have managed to have an heir together. Napoleon has very good cause to divorce Josephine, especially early on in the marriage. She betrays him in an immensely humiliating way. This was very public. The British managed to get hold of her love letters to the man she's kind of cuckolding Napoleon with and start publishing them. Napoleon doesn't divorce her then. He forgives her. He moves on. The relationship dynamic has changed irreparably, but nevertheless, they'll remain together. And in my opinion, it's only the fact that Napoleon realizes he desperately needs an heir that causes this marriage to break down irrevocably.
Yeah, and it's tragic that Josephine dies in 1814 while Napoleon's on Elba. And I know it deeply upsets him. He doesn't see anyone for 2 days. And yeah, you can tell that he still really loved her.
Most definitely. Josephine, for better or for worse, is for Napoleon just a guiding light throughout his life. He is just obsessed with her. And, Marie Louise is a woman he falls in love with and eventually comes to move on from. Josephine, he never moves on from.
Yeah, and coincidence or not, after he's divorced from Josephine, his empire starts to slowly fall apart. It's just ironic.
Absolutely.
Oh, man, what an episode. Well, thank you for that, Catherine. That was great. Again, Catherine's working on a great biography. I cannot wait to read it on the Bonaparte family called The Bonapartes. And you can find her on Twitter at KEBAYF. And I highly recommend you follow her channel there. Catherine, it was an absolute pleasure.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.